June 12, 1945. Victory in Europe Day had passed just over a month ago, and across America, prisoner of war camps were emptying as German soldiers prepared for the long journey home to their defeated homeland. In the desert facility outside Florence, Arizona, 52 German women prisoners stood in the mess hall, facing Captain Dorothy Brennan as she held official repatriation orders from the War Department. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor where these women had shared meals, learned English, and slowly transformed from enemies into something no one had quite expected. Captain Brennan's voice was steady but compassionate as she began. "Ladies, transportation has been arranged for your return to Germany. You'll depart in 2 weeks, processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before release to your homes." She paused, watching the mixture of relief and anxiety play across their faces. What she didn't expect was the sound of a chair scraping against the floor as 24-year-old Katharina Vogel stood up, her hands trembling despite her attempt at military composure. "Captain Brennan," Katharina said in careful English that still carried the rhythms of Frankfurt, "may I speak for some of us?" "Permission granted," the captain replied, her eyes narrowing slightly with curiosity. Katharina looked around at her fellow prisoners, finding the faces of those who had spent countless nights discussing this very moment. 19-year-old Rosa Bauer stood next, followed by 8 other women who had made their decision during the long Arizona winter. They formed a small group within the larger assembly, their choice clearly made after months of agonizing deliberation. "Captain," Katharina continued, her voice growing stronger, "some of us do not wish to return to Germany immediately." The words hung in the desert air like an impossible dream. Several American guards exchanged confused glances, unsure they had heard correctly. Rosa spoke next in halting English, her youth making her vulnerability even more apparent. "The Germany we left is not there anymore. The Germany we served, we learned, was not the Germany we believed existed." Captain Brennan felt her military training fail her for one of the few times in her career. In all her experience with prisoner operations, she had never encountered this. Enemy prisoners requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept their freedom. It defied everything she understood about human nature and military procedure. "I need you to explain exactly what you're asking," she said slowly, buying time to process the unprecedented situation unfolding before her. What followed was an outpouring that revealed just how deeply these women had changed during their 8 months in American captivity. But to understand why 10 German women would make such an impossible request, you had to go back to the beginning, to a cold October morning when they first arrived in the Arizona desert, still believing they knew who their enemies were. October 15th, 1944. The transport truck rolled through the gates of Camp Florence just as the sun began its descent over the Sonoran Desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that none of the German women had ever seen before. They had traveled from the East Coast, transferred multiple times, and spent the last 36 hours watching America's vast landscape roll past through the truck's canvas opening. Katharina Vogel pressed her face close to the gap, trying to comprehend the sheer size of this country that had seemed so distant and abstract when she had plotted radio coordinates for the Wehrmacht. The desert itself was a shock. These women came from the green valleys of the Rhine, the forests of Bavaria, the orderly cities of northern Germany. This landscape of sand, sparse vegetation, and endless sky felt alien and hostile. As they stepped down from the truck, the dry heat hit them like a physical force, so different from the October cold they associated with autumn. Captain Dorothy Brennan stood waiting, flanked by a small contingent of guards. She had been given less than a week's notice about this unusual assignment. Female German prisoners were rare enough, but establishing a separate facility for them presented unique challenges. She watched as the 52 women formed ragged lines, their gray auxiliary uniforms dusty from travel, their faces showing the careful blankness that came from weeks of uncertainty about their fate. Katerina was among the first to step forward for processing. She carried only a small canvas bag containing a change of clothes, a photograph of her family that she kept hidden, and a fountain pen her father had given her before the war. At 24, she had served as a communications specialist, believing she was protecting her homeland from invasion. Now, standing in an American prison camp thousands of miles from Frankfurt, she felt the first tremors of doubt about everything she had been taught. The youngest prisoner, Rosa Bauer, stood near the back of the formation. At 19, she looked even younger, her blonde hair pulled back severely, her blue eyes wide with barely suppressed fear. She had been conscripted into auxiliary service just 8 months earlier, assigned to administrative duties in Belgium. Her capture had come during the chaotic retreat, and she still didn't fully understand how she had ended up here in this impossible landscape, so far from everything she knew. The initial processing was conducted with military efficiency, but without cruelty. The women were assigned to barracks, given basic supplies, and informed of camp routines. Captain Brennan made a point of addressing them directly, her voice firm but not harsh. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work, you will follow regulations, and you will be safe here. That is my promise to you." But promises from enemies meant little to women who had spent years hearing about American brutality and ruthlessness. That first night, the 52 German women huddled in their barracks, speaking in whispered German, trying to make sense of their situation and wondering what morning would bring. The first weeks at Camp Florence passed in a haze of routine and careful distance. The German women rose at dawn, attended roll call with military precision, performed assigned duties, and retreated into themselves during any free moments. They moved through the camp like ghosts, present but not truly there, their faces carefully composed into masks of dignified resignation. Katerina noticed how her fellow prisoners maintained their bearing even in captivity, standing straighter than some of the American guards, refusing to let defeat show in their posture even as uncertainty gnawed at their hearts. Meals were eaten in near silence. The women clustered at tables, speaking only in hushed German when absolutely necessary. They had been warned by older prisoners during their transfer that Americans would try to break their spirits, would attempt to turn them against their homeland through psychological manipulation. So they maintained their distance, their solidarity, their shared identity as soldiers who had been captured but not conquered. Captain Brennan observed this careful isolation with growing concern. She had dealt with male German prisoners before, had seen the same initial defiance and suspicion, but something about these women troubled her differently. They were so young, most of them barely out of their teenage years, and she could see the fear beneath their rigid military bearing. She began making a point of walking through the camp during different times of day, not inspecting but simply being present, trying to show through her actions that they had nothing to fear from her. The American guards, mostly young men deemed unfit for frontline combat due to injuries or medical conditions, didn't quite know how to interact with female prisoners. Some treated them with exaggerated formality, others with awkward attempts at kindness that were usually rebuffed. Corporal Michael O'Connor, a stocky 26-year-old from rural Pennsylvania, had been assigned to kitchen duties after a training accident left him with a permanent limp. He watched the German women file through the mess line each day, noting how they took their portions without meeting anyone's eyes, how they ate mechanically as if the food held no taste or meaning. Rosa Bauer struggled more than most during those early weeks. Away from home for the first time in her life, imprisoned in a foreign country, she found herself fighting tears during the long desert nights. She had written letters to her family in Cologne, but had no idea if they had survived the Allied bombing campaigns. The not knowing was worse than any physical hardship the camp imposed. The other women tried to comfort her, but their own uncertainties left them with little reassurance to offer. November brought cooler temperatures to the Arizona desert, and with it, the first small cracks in the wall between captors and prisoners. It started, as many significant changes do, with something mundane. One of the older German women, a former nurse named Helga Werner, noticed that Rosa had developed a persistent cough that grew worse each night. She approached Captain Brennan during morning roll call, speaking in broken English to request medical attention for the girl. Captain Brennan immediately arranged for Rosa to see the camp medical officer, and that simple act of responsiveness surprised the German women. They had expected bureaucratic delays, indifference to their suffering, perhaps even deliberate neglect. Instead, Rosa received prompt treatment, was given additional blankets, and was excused from outdoor duties until her cough subsided. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it planted the first seed of doubt about what they had been taught to expect from their American captors. December 7, 1944. 3 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, though none of the German women knew the significance of that date in American memory. The Arizona desert had turned surprisingly cold at night, and the women wrapped themselves in their issued blankets, still adjusting to this strange land of temperature extremes. Corporal Michael O'Connor stood in the camp kitchen that morning, stirring a massive pot with methodical care. His grandmother back in Pennsylvania had taught him that certain foods carried more than nutrition, they carried comfort, memory, and the possibility of connection. He had convinced Captain Brennan to let him prepare something special for the evening meal, arguing that the approaching Christmas season called for small gestures of humanity even toward enemies. The rice pudding had been simmering since early afternoon, filling the kitchen with the scent of cinnamon, vanilla, and sweetness. O'Connor had used precious sugar rations, real cream from the officers' stores, and plump raisins that cost him 2 weeks of cigarette money. His fellow guards thought he was wasting effort on women who wouldn't appreciate it, who would probably view any kindness as weakness or manipulation. But O'Connor remembered his own grandmother's stories about kindness during hard times, how a simple dessert could remind people of their humanity when everything else tried to strip it away. That evening, as the German women filed through the mess line for their usual dinner of meat, potatoes, and vegetables, they noticed something different at the end of the serving counter. Large bowls of creamy rice pudding sat waiting, steam rising from their surfaces, the aroma completely foreign to what they had come to expect from prison camp food. Katerina stopped, staring at the dessert with confusion and suspicion. Was this some kind of test? Some American trick to lower their guard? O'Connor stood behind the counter, ladle in hand, his expression neither hostile nor overly friendly. "Rice pudding?" he said simply, offering a generous portion to the first woman in line. "My grandmother's recipe." The woman took the bowl hesitantly, looking back at her companions for guidance. Katerina watched as the first few prisoners received their portions and carried them to the tables, setting them down without tasting, waiting to see if there was some catch, some hidden purpose behind this unexpected sweetness. Rosa Bauer, still recovering from her cough but back to regular duties, took her bowl and sat next to Katerina. The younger woman stared at the pudding, watching the steam curl upward, inhaling the scent of cinnamon that reminded her painfully of Christmas mornings in Cologne before the war. Her hand trembled as she lifted the spoon. The first taste hit Rosa like a memory made physical. Creamy, sweet, rich with vanilla, and studded with plump raisins. It was nothing like the watery, flavorless gruel they had eaten in the last months of Germany's collapsing war effort. This was real food, prepared with care, seasoned with spices that had become luxuries even in civilian German life. Her eyes widened, and before she could stop herself, a small sound of surprise and pleasure escaped her lips. Around the mess hall, similar reactions rippled through the tables. Women who had maintained rigid composure for weeks found themselves confronting something they hadn't expected. Generosity. Not the bare minimum required by the Geneva Convention, but actual thoughtfulness. The pudding wasn't just edible, it was delicious. It was made with ingredients that even their own families back home could no longer obtain. Katerina took her first spoonful and felt something shift inside her chest. She had been taught that Americans were wasteful, materialistic, concerned only with their own comfort. Yet here was a guard, a man who owed them nothing, who had spent his own resources to create something beautiful for his enemies. December 24, 1944. The camp's recreation hall had been transformed, with modest decorations made from whatever materials the women could gather. Paper chains cut from old newspapers, pine branches brought in from the surrounding desert hills, and a small tree that Corporal O'Connor had somehow acquired from a supplier in Phoenix. The transformation wasn't elaborate, but it was enough to evoke memories of Christmases past, of homes that might no longer exist, of families whose fates remained unknown. Captain Brennan had wrestled with how to handle the holiday. She understood that these women were far from home, facing an uncertain future, and that the holiday season could either break their spirits completely or offer a chance for something more constructive than mere survival. Katerina had been chosen by the other women to approach Captain Brennan with a request. Her English had improved dramatically over the past 2 months, partly from necessity and partly from her own natural aptitude for languages. She stood in the captain's office, hands clasped nervously, searching for the right words. "Captain Brennan," she began, "we would like permission to prepare some German Christmas traditions, songs, perhaps some decorations. But also," she paused, gathering courage, "we would like to learn American Christmas songs, to sing for you and the guards, as thanks." The captain studied the young woman before her, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the careful way she chose her words. "You want to sing for us?" she asked, making sure she understood correctly. Katerina nodded. "After the rice pudding, after the kindness shown to Rosa when she was sick, we talked among ourselves. We realized we have been waiting for cruelty that has not come. It seemed right to show gratitude." That evening, the recreation hall filled with an unlikely gathering. 52 German women prisoners stood on one side, facing Captain Brennan, Corporal O'Connor, and 20 American guards on the other. The tension was palpable, but underneath it ran a current of something new, something fragile but genuine. The women began with Stille Nacht, their voices blending in harmonies that had been practiced in German churches for generations. The beauty of it silenced the Americans completely. Even those who spoke no German could hear the longing in those voices, the homesickness, the memory of better times. Then came the moment that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. The German women, led by Katerina, attempted Silent Night in English. Their pronunciation was imperfect, their accents thick, but the intention behind every word was crystal clear. Rosa's young voice rose above the others at certain points, pure and clear despite her lingering cough. She sang with her eyes closed, and tears streamed down her face as she navigated the unfamiliar English words. When the song ended, silence filled the hall for a long moment. Then Captain Brennan began to applause, and the American guards joined her. Corporal O'Connor had prepared more rice pudding for the evening, along with precious coffee and cookies baked using his grandmother's recipe. "Merry Christmas," he said simply. February 10, 1945. The camp library received newspapers twice a week from Phoenix, and the German women had developed the habit of reading them to practice their English. What had begun as a language exercise became something far more devastating. Katerina sat at a wooden table, an edition of the New York Times spread before her, and felt the floor drop out from beneath her understanding of the world. The photographs were grainy but unmistakable. Piles of emaciated bodies, skeletal survivors staring at cameras with hollow eyes. Allied troops discovering camps with names she had never heard. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The accompanying articles described systematic murder, gas chambers, deliberate starvation, experiments conducted on human beings as if they were laboratory animals. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She read the same paragraph 3 times, hoping her English comprehension was failing her, hoping she was misunderstanding the words. But the meaning was brutally clear. This had happened in Germany. In her Germany. While she had been plotting radio coordinates and believing she served a righteous cause. Rosa found her there an hour later, still frozen at the table, tears streaming silently down her face. The younger woman picked up another newspaper, began reading, and within minutes was sobbing openly. Other women gathered, drawn by the sound of Rosa's distress. They picked up papers, read in growing horror, passed sections to each other with trembling hands. The room filled with the sound of women confronting the complete destruction of everything they thought they knew about their homeland. "This cannot be real," whispered Helga Werner, the former nurse. But even as she said it, something in her expression acknowledged that it could be, that it was. "We would have known," another woman insisted desperately. "Someone would have told us. Our families would have written about such things." But the words rang hollow. They all knew that letters had been censored, that information had been controlled, that they had been fed only what the regime wanted them to believe. Katerina stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. She walked to the window, staring out at the Arizona desert, seeing nothing. She thought of her father who had been so proud when she joined the Auxiliary Corps. She thought of her teachers who had spoken of Germany's glorious destiny. She thought of herself, just 2 years ago, certain of her purpose and her country's righteousness. Captain Brennan entered the library and immediately understood what had happened. She had been dreading this moment, knowing it was inevitable but unsure how to handle it. These women weren't hardened ideologues. They were young, they had believed they served their country's defense, and now they were learning they had been part of something monstrous. "Is it true?" Katerina asked without turning from the window, her voice barely above a whisper. "All of it?" The captain moved to stand beside her. "Yes," she said simply. "It's true." That night, 52 women lay awake in their barracks, staring into darkness, wondering who they had really been. April 20th, 1945. Spring in the Arizona desert brought wildflowers that seemed impossible in such harsh terrain, small bursts of color that appeared overnight and vanished just as quickly. The German women watched these brief blooms with particular attention, seeing in them a mirror of their own uncertain futures. News from Europe grew increasingly grim for Germany. The Reich was collapsing, cities falling to Allied forces, the war clearly reaching its inevitable conclusion. Letters from home had stopped arriving weeks ago, and the silence terrified the women more than any news could have. Katerina had received her last letter from Frankfurt in early March. Her mother's handwriting had been shaky, the paper thin and cheap, the message brief and carefully worded to pass censorship. "We are well. Your father works still. The city changes daily. We pray for you." Nothing about food shortages, nothing about the bombing that Katerina knew must be devastating her hometown, nothing real. Just carefully constructed words meant to provide comfort while revealing nothing. Rosa had heard nothing from Cologne in 5 months. She spent hours in the library, reading every newspaper account she could find about the Allied advance through Western Germany, searching for any mention of her city. When she finally found a report describing Cologne as 90% destroyed, she sat motionless for so long that Helga had to physically lead her back to the barracks. The transformation in the camp had become complete by this point. The careful distance of those first months had dissolved entirely. German women worked alongside American staff, not out of obligation but from genuine desire to contribute. Katerina had become the unofficial translator and administrative assistant to Captain Brennan, handling correspondence and helping to manage camp operations. Her English was now nearly fluent, and she had discovered talents for organization and communication she never knew she possessed. Rosa, despite her youth and ongoing grief about her family's unknown fate, had found purpose working in the camp's small medical facility. Under Helga's supervision, she learned basic nursing skills and discovered that helping others provided relief from her own suffering. Corporal O'Connor continued his small acts of culinary kindness, but they no longer felt like gestures from captor to prisoner, they felt like community. When he baked bread using techniques his grandmother had taught him, the German women contributed recipes from their own traditions. The camp kitchen became a space of cultural exchange, where food served as a language more powerful than words. But beneath these daily routines ran a current of growing anxiety. Everyone knew that repatriation was coming. The war would end, and these women would be sent back to whatever remained of Germany. Captain Brennan watched them grapple with this approaching reality and saw something she had never witnessed before: prisoners who seemed more afraid of freedom than of captivity. One evening in late April, Katerina sat in the captain's office, helping to file reports. She paused, pen in hand, and spoke without looking up. What if there is nothing to return to? What if everyone is gone? Captain Brennan had no answer that could ease that fear. She simply placed her hand on the younger woman's shoulder and let the silence speak what words could not. June 12, 1945. The moment had finally arrived. The moment they had all known was inevitable, yet somehow still felt unprepared to face. Captain Brennan stood before the assembled German women in the mess hall, official documents from the War Department in her hands. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the desert heat. 52 women stood in formation, no longer the rigid military bearing of those first October days, but a looser, more natural gathering of people who had become something approaching a community. "Ladies," Captain Brennan began, her voice steady but touched with emotion she couldn't quite hide, "I have received orders regarding your repatriation to Germany. Transportation will be arranged within 2 weeks. You will be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to your homes or to locate your families." She paused, watching the mixture of relief and dread play across their faces. Some women had been waiting desperately for this moment. Others looked as though they might be sick. What Captain Brennan didn't expect was the sound of Katerina Vogel's chair scraping against the floor. The young woman stood slowly, her hands visibly shaking despite months of growing confidence. In clear, careful English that bore only the slightest accent now, she addressed the captain directly. "Captain Brennan, may I speak for some of us?" The captain felt a flutter of uncertainty but nodded. "Permission granted, Katerina." The young woman looked around at her fellow prisoners. Finding the faces of those with whom she had spent countless nights in whispered conversation, debating, arguing, crying over the impossible choice that faced them. Rosa Bauer stood next, her 19-year-old face showing a maturity that 8 months had carved into her features. Then Helga Werner, then 6 others. 10 women total, forming a small group within the larger assembly. "Captain," Katerina continued, her voice growing stronger even as her hands continued to tremble, "we have been talking among ourselves for many weeks now. Some of us do not wish to return to Germany immediately." The words landed like stones thrown into still water, ripples of shock spreading through both the German prisoners and the American staff. Several guards exchanged confused glances. Captain Brennan felt her military composure slip for just a moment, unsure she had heard correctly. "I need you to clarify what you're asking," she said slowly, buying herself time to process what seemed impossible. Rosa spoke next, her English still halting but her meaning unmistakable. "We know what we ask is unusual, Captain. But Germany is not our home anymore. The Germany we served, we discovered, was not the Germany we believed existed." Anna Fischer, one of the older women in the group requesting to stay, added in heavily accented English, "Here we have found something we did not expect. Dignity. Purpose. The chance to become better than we were." The implications of their request hung in the desert air, unprecedented and shocking, demanding answers that no one in that room knew how to provide. The days following the unprecedented request passed in a strange state of suspension. Captain Brennan had sent urgent communications to her superiors in Washington, describing a situation that had no precedent in American military history. Enemy prisoners of war requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept repatriation to their homeland. While waiting for official response, the camp existed in an atmosphere of tense hope and uncertain possibility. The 10 women who had requested to stay continued their daily routines with renewed intensity, as if their contributions might somehow influence decisions being made hundreds of miles away in government offices. Katerina threw herself into her translation work, helping to process the enormous backlog of displaced persons paperwork that flowed through the camp. Rosa spent long hours in the medical facility, learning everything Helga could teach her about nursing care. Each woman seemed driven to prove that their request came from genuine transformation rather than mere opportunism or fear. But their efforts revealed something deeper than strategy. They had found meaning in these daily activities, had discovered talents and purposes they never knew they possessed during their previous lives in Germany. The other 42 women watched this drama unfold with mixed emotions. Some felt the 10 were betraying their homeland, choosing comfort over duty. Others understood completely, but lacked the courage to make the same choice themselves. Conversations in the barracks grew heated at times, old bonds of solidarity strained by fundamentally different visions of what loyalty and survival meant. Corporal O'Connor became one of the most vocal advocates for the women's request. He approached Captain Brennan in her office one afternoon, his Pennsylvania farm boy directness cutting through military protocol. "Ma'am, I know I'm out of line saying this, but these women aren't our enemies anymore. They're just people who got caught up in something bigger than they understood. Sending them back to nothing seems wrong." The captain studied the young man who had started this entire transformation with a simple bowl of rice pudding. "It's not about what seems right, Corporal. It's about law, about procedure, about what the Geneva Convention requires and what our government permits." The response from Washington arrived on June 18th, delivered by courier, and marked with enough official stamps to indicate it had passed through multiple levels of bureaucratic review. Captain Brennan read it twice before calling the women together. The answer was characteristically bureaucratic, but unexpectedly flexible. The War Department would not prevent immediate repatriation for anyone who wished it. However, given the unusual circumstances and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, those who wished to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status. But there was a significant caveat. They would no longer be prisoners of war under military jurisdiction. They would need to find civilian sponsors, secure employment, and obtain housing in American communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. The government would provide no support beyond the initial processing. The 10 women faced a choice even more daunting than their original request. They could return to known devastation in Germany, or they could leap into complete uncertainty in America, with no guarantee of success or acceptance. 20 years later, 1965. Katharina Vogel stood in the kitchen of her small home in Tucson, Arizona, stirring a pot of rice pudding with the same methodical care that Corporal Michael O'Connor had shown 2 decades earlier. Her children, 2 boys aged 12 and 14, sat at the kitchen table doing homework, occasionally glancing up at their mother with the casual affection of kids who had never known anything but security and love. Her husband, an engineer she had met while working as a translator for the State Department, would be home soon. This life, this impossible American dream, had grown from a single bowl of dessert offered by a limping farm boy who believed in kindness over hatred. The rice pudding simmered, filling the kitchen with cinnamon and vanilla, and Katharina found herself transported back to that December evening in 1944 when she first tasted sweetness from enemy hands. She had kept in touch with Captain Brennan over the years, exchanging Christmas cards and occasional letters. The captain, now retired, had written recently about attending a reunion of former Camp Florence staff. O'Connor had become a successful farmer in Pennsylvania, married with 5 children. He still made his grandmother's rice pudding every Christmas. Rosa Bauer had taken a different path, but an equally remarkable one. She had completed nursing school in Phoenix and eventually returned to Germany in 1958 as part of a medical exchange program. She found Cologne rebuilt, transformed, no longer the devastated wasteland she had feared. More importantly, she found 3 surviving cousins who had thought her dead. She divided her time now between Germany and America, serving as a bridge between the 2 countries, carrying with her the lessons learned in an Arizona prison camp about the power of human connection to overcome hatred. Of the 10 women who had chosen to stay, 7 had built successful lives in America. 2 had returned to Germany after 5 years, feeling called to contribute to their homeland's reconstruction. One had married an American soldier and moved to California, where she taught German at a local high school. Each had taken the unexpected gift of American kindness and transformed it into something meaningful and lasting. The 42 women who had chosen immediate repatriation in 1945 had played their own crucial role. They carried back to devastated Germany stories of American compassion that helped convince other Germans that their former enemies could be trusted. Several became leaders in German-American friendship societies, working to strengthen bonds between nations that had once tried to destroy each other. Katerina's oldest son looked up from his homework. "Mom, why do you always make rice pudding on this date?" She smiled, stirring the pot one more time before turning off the heat. "Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness change everything. This pudding reminds me that people can choose to be better than their circumstances require." She served the dessert to her family that evening, and as she watched them enjoy it, she thought about that impossible moment 20 years ago, when 10 German women dared to ask for something unprecedented, a second chance.